Google is now ignoring the vast majority of content online. Let's talk about why this is and how you can make sure your pages don't get ignored. So it used to be that Google included the majority of content online in their index, meaning when you did a Google search, Google was looking through most of the pages on the internet. And that's because there was a manageable number of pages. But eventually that number became unmanageable. And with ChatGPT and other large language models creating content, it just doesn't make sense economically for Google to index every page on the internet. And Google understands that most of these pages are saying the same thing as another page, and there's no real value in indexing the same information multiple times. This is commonly called commodity content. It's not adding anything new, and Google doesn't want it bloating their index. So in that case, they attempt to identify the most authoritative source of that information and only index that one. So if you want your content to be indexed by Google, you need to make sure they don't see it as commodity content. However, here's the thing. Google's algorithm doesn't truly understand if the information in your content is repeated across other websites, unless it's actually duplicate content. It's not reading every page that gets published to the internet and understanding the information in it. That would be way too expensive. Rather, it's using proxies to estimate whether or not your content is commodity content. And there's two main ways it does this. First of all, it just looks at the URL of the page. That's right. A lot of the times, Google decides your content is commodity content without even looking at the content. If you go into Google Search Console and you look at your pages report, you might find some of your pages marked as discovered, not indexed. These are pages that Google didn't even bother to look at. They just found the URL and decided, nah, we don't want this in our index. There's two main reasons this might happen. The first is that Google determines it's just not the type of page people would want to find in search. Maybe this is outdated information. You have an old year on the title, or it's like your COVID policy, or maybe it's like a thank you confirmation page or your privacy policy. In that case, there's really no issue. You're not trying to drive search traffic to those pages. But the other situation is that Google already has content on the topic implied by the URL, and it doesn't see your website as the top authority on this topic. In that case, you got to honestly ask yourself, do you have the authority to speak on this topic? Are there brands 10 times or 100 times your size that are also creating content on this topic? If so, you might want to find a more niche topic, one that your brand is honestly an authority on. However, if you do have the authority to write on this topic, then you probably want to submit that page to Google to have it reconsider indexing it. You can do that in Google Search Console, and it'll force Google to crawl the page. However, there's another issue you might find in Google Search Console called crawled not indexed. This means they found your URL and thought, there might be something interesting here, and then looked at the content and decide, never mind. In this case, it could be an authority issue or it could be a content issue. The more authority your website has, the less critical they're going to be of the content. But let's focus on the content side, since that's the only one you can address immediately. If Google is crawling your page and determining the content is commodity content, it's likely because it's seeing it as generic or thin. Thin just means there's not enough information on the page. Generic has more to do with the structure of the page than the actual content. Because again, remember, Google's not reading every page and actually understanding the information. They're using proxies. To make your content appear less generic to Google, you want really high fact density. Make sure you're including a lot of statistics, data points, quotes, charts, tables, bullet points. All of these things are proxies for depth or high effort content. And you could absolutely use AI to write all this content, but you can't just use ChatGPT out of the box. If you just go to your favorite large language model and say, write me a blog post on this topic, it's going to come out very generic. Instead, you should have that AI connected to a knowledge base about your brand. You should share with it any opinions or experience you have on the topic. You should have it perform in-depth research, and you should give it clear SEO guidelines. How to do all of that is beyond the scope of this video, but it's what we do for all of our clients, and it's very rare that a page we create isn't indexed by Google.